How's it going, everybody? Ed Ricker here, and in front of me I have the Autel EVO II Pro 6K drone. Yes, it shoots 6K video. Now, I've never shot 6K video with a camera or a drone or anything else, so this is pretty new to me. In this video, I'm going to show you some of that footage. I'm going to talk about the drone. I'm also going to talk about why you might want to shoot or not shoot in 6K. What's the point? Refer to the YouTube play bar or the timestamps in the description to skip to parts of this video that may be of most interest to you. Also, make sure to watch this video on YouTube in the max resolution available to you. Straight out of the box, this drone comes folded up, along with the remote controller, which also folds up. So it's a very, very portable drone, compact in size until you unfold it and reveal those 9-inch bi-blade props. The 6K camera is pretty insane, and like I said earlier, I've never shot in 6K resolution, so I've had a great time experimenting with 6K, punching in, scaling up, and maintaining quality through either a 1080 or a 4K export. The camera has a variable aperture as opposed to the fixed aperture of this drone's little brother, the original Autel EVO, or the 8K version of this drone. So there is an Autel EVO II 8K, and that's not what we're talking about today, and don't get them confused. For instance, the 8K version does not have a variable aperture, it has a fixed aperture. The 8K version also has a 1/2-inch sensor as opposed to the 6K's 1-inch sensor. So even though you're not getting 8K resolution, you're getting 6K with a 1-inch sensor and a variable aperture. The shutter is electronic, it's not mechanical, however, but when you move this around like you normally would with a drone, you might not see rolling shutter issues that you would get with an electronic shutter on a handheld camera or something like that. The 6K resolution that it's recording is actually 5472 pixels by 3076 pixels. And then the camera can also do 20 megapixel photos. So those photos will be 5472 by 3648. HDR video mode is also available in 4K. It's not available in 6K, and it's also not available in 4K if you have manual exposure. And that took a little while for me to figure out. You have to be in auto camera exposure mode, and then HDR becomes available to you right next to the record button. You can also shoot in 10-bit A-log format, where you would then color grade, you put your lookup table in, and get a nice professional quality color gradable image out of this camera. In 6K resolution, you have access to 30, 25, and 24 frames per second. If you knock that down to 4K, you have access to up to 60 frames per second. You can slow that footage down halfway if you want to for some nice slow-mo effect. And of course, if you go down to 2.7K, you have access to 120 frames per second. You can slow that down 4 times and still maintain a 30 frame per second export. So 4x slow-mo. Now, one really cool feature about the Autel Explorer app when paired with the 6K camera, you can also digitally zoom in using the Autel Explorer app. You can select between 1x, 2x, 4x, or 8x, or use the slider on the screen to make adjustments within those values. It's incredible how much you can zoom in on a subject just using the app. And yes, the recorded video file also does the same thing while you're recording. This means that for a 1080 export, you're getting 3x lossless zoom. The size of the folded up drone is pretty impressive considering this is over 2.5 pounds in weight, or almost 1,200 grams. What makes up a good chunk of that weight is the sizable 7100 milliamp hour battery, which they say has upwards of 40-minute flight time. So you might get less than 40 minutes, especially if you're outside flying on a breezy day or flying this around at the max 45 mile an hour top speed in ludicrous mode. And that 40-minute battery life is one of the specs that, when paired with the camera quality, makes this a great prosumer or professional drone. Something you would actually use for commercial gigs, something that might replace other drones like your old Phantom 4 Pro or something like that. The variable aperture is from f2.8 to f11, and there are also ND filter options, like I have this one from Freewell Gear, which I'll be using in some of these videos upcoming with the Autel EVO II Pro 6K. So when you pair a nice ND filter kit like the Freewell All Day 8-pack with the Autel EVO II Pro 6K, you've got a great setup here that you can use for commercial gigs. The remote controller also unfolds and has a nice bracket for a display device, normally a cell phone. In this case, I'm using a Pixel 4 XL. Shout out to Team Pixel. They give you a couple cables in the box, which are micro USB to micro USB or micro USB to USB-C, which I will be using with the Pixel 4. They don't give you a lightning cable, so you'll probably have to get that separately if you have an iPhone. This controller setup is pretty good, although I don't think this bracket is going to be robust enough to hold like an iPad mini or something that big. There is also a 3.3-inch OLED display built into the controller, so if you forget your cell phone or you drop your cell phone, your cell phone's battery's out of life, something, you're going to be able to still fly in somewhat of a limited capacity. It's kind of cumbersome, but you could still use that 3.3-inch OLED if you really need to. Now, a couple years ago, I reviewed the original Autel EVO, and that was a good drone as well. A couple things I liked about the Autel EVO back then were the normal versus ludicrous mode. So you can push this into ludicrous mode and pick your max speed that you would fly in ludicrous mode. So this one is 45 miles per hour max speed, but in normal mode, it's more like 22 miles per hour, something like that, more controllable. You can also dial in those max settings. You could even make this max out at 11 miles an hour for more of maybe a fast tripod mode. Now you see these circular spots all around the drone. There are 2 on every face of the drone for a total of 12. These are your obstacle avoidance sensors, and they create 360-degree obstacle avoidance. And when paired with the dual core processor that's inside of this drone, it does a great job of tracking a subject like me on my longboard the other day in the parking lot. It was weaving around all the parking lot lights and all the trees and everything. It was really impressive how it stuck with me. Lost me a few times when I went behind a tree or something like that, or I changed directions really fast, but in dynamic track mode, this was doing really well. There's also a radar system that, even though you might want to turn off your obstacle avoidance momentarily for maybe more of a close confines flights that you want to be really careful with, but you need the mobility, you can turn off obstacle avoidance but still have your radar on. In that case, you have a graphical representation of some of the objects around you, and it's telling you what is nearby. And that way, at least you can go by that, and you can pilot this safely without running into anything while still have obstacle avoidance turned off. Now, if obstacle avoidance is turned on, even though it works great and it picks up on everything, sometimes that's a little frustrating. It almost works too good. So you might be 20 feet away from an object, and this is already, beginning its slowdown. And you do have a little bit of room to spare, So like when I'm trying to fly around certain places where I would normally have obstacle avoidance on, I actually have to turn it off with this, because the obstacle avoidance will almost paralyze the drone. It won't move at all because it's sensing so much around it that it's stopping it in place. And so it's almost overkill. With that said, flying it around larger locations, open areas, I do feel a lot safer with having such a reactive obstacle avoidance, which will stop me if I am heading for the trees or a power line. There's also phase detection autofocus, so even though you can tap on the screen to focus on certain objects, it's gonna still maintain a good autofocus, and you won't have a completely out of focus image or video when you're shooting. There's also a defogging mode, which I thought was interesting. I had to kind of look it up to know what that was. If you toggle that in the menu of the Autel Explorer app, you'll see the horizon get a little more contrasty and dark. And so basically, I think what it's doing is it's adding a little saturation and contrast to places in the image where it might be a bit hazy. Maybe it's foggy, or maybe it's a hazy day, or maybe like now with pollen going so crazy in North Carolina, everything looks a little bit hazy. So when you're flying with this, you turn on defogging, and you can select just how intense that defogging effect is. You can kind of remove that. But one thing I do like about Autel products is they're not geofenced. So if you ever use maybe a DJI product, you know that it's going to limit you to prevent takeoff in certain environments. That's supposed to be a safety feature for those who don't know any better, but for people like me who know where I can and can't fly, I would rather make that decision. The app may not always be right, and it might also be malfunctioning. What if I want to take this off in a big warehouse to get some interiors, but I'm near an airport and it's limiting me? Well, with Autel, it's not going to limit me. It's not going to prevent me from taking off like maybe a DJI product would. So no geofencing with Autel. The transmission is, according to the box, 9 kilometers. And I don't think I would ever need to fly this beyond that. In fact, I normally don't fly more than half a mile. Now, the Autel EVO has great dynamic range, especially when you're shooting in log, and it's really amazing. It's really sharp. You've got so many different variables, so many different exposure controls, both auto, manual, all this stuff. One thing I do notice though is when I dial in my specific white balance, this always tends to be a little on the warm side. And I think it's kind of funny because the drone itself is orange. So there's always a bit of a warm sort of hue to everything. So I was watching Original Dobo's video about the Autel EVO II Pro 6K. What he does is he kind of dials back a few 100K on the color temperature, and that way he can get a great color temperature out of this drone, as opposed to using some of those presets like cloudy or sunny. So I like the drone and I like the remote for the most part. However, we kind of had this issue with the original Autel EVO. The remote style makes it very easy to press these two rear A and B buttons unintentionally. So when I'm flying around, or I pick this up, or I lay it down, there's a very good chance that I will accidentally press one of these buttons, to the point that I actually don't customize them, because I do hit them inadvertently often. You can customize them to do various functions, but otherwise, everything else about the drone feels pretty good with the remote. The controllability, however, it suffers a bit. And what I mean by that is, if I'm trying to do a very intricate movement and very slow, very gradual, say I'm orbiting something, or I'm trying to move from one subject to another, the smoothness isn't necessarily there with the movement. And sometimes it'll move and you're trying to yaw and finally it'll take. You know, it's not like a nice gradual move. It performs well in wind because of the low profile. That's a good thing. But when you're actually trying to move around very, very carefully, I do have some issues with this. Now, maybe I have to spend some more time with the sticks here, I don't know. There are also some expo, some sensitivity settings in the app for the remote control gimbal sticks, which maybe I just have to spend some time dialing in. So it's good that we have that option to adjust the sensitivity of these gimbals, because otherwise, yeah, I just don't like the feel of them, the way that they move the drone sometimes. The speed of the drone is great at 45 miles per hour with ludicrous mode, but I do realize that when you're fighting a headwind, you're not going to get anywhere near that. You might top out at 30 miles per hour, which I think is kind of interesting. I did pick myself up another battery just because that's upwards of 80 minutes, realistically maybe 70 minutes of flight time, and that gets me through most jobs that I would need to do with this drone. I don't normally have to fly more than 70 minutes at a time. And then what I can do is, you know, pop this on my car charger or something, and I can just charge in the back of my vehicle if I need to. The gimbal performs well, even if you have an ND filter on, it still boots up and calibrates just fine. One thing that is interesting though is, you know, it has a 30-degree up tilt that you can enable, which is great. But if you're flying forward fast, you're not going to be able to maintain that 30-degree up tilt. It'll struggle. The drone comes with one charger, well, I should say a charger for one battery. There are also other options you can buy to charge multiple batteries sequentially, but this charger gets the job done. It also has a USB-C port, so you can charge the remote at the same time. When I got the drone, it came with a 32 gigabyte micro SD card, but that only gets you about 32 minutes of 6K recording time. So if you plan on doing a lot of 6K recording time, you're going to want to get a bigger micro SD card. So I use a 256 gigabyte one, and now space is no longer a concern. There's also a 6 gigabyte, they bill it as 8, but really it's 6 gigabyte flash internal memory on the drone. I'm sort of surprised that that's not bigger internal flash memory. It'd be nice to see a 32 gigabyte flash internal memory. Return to home works well. I didn't really test a precision return to home, but I've returned to home a couple times with this drone and it worked just fine. You set your return to home altitude, which I usually have to 60 meters, and then you know, it comes back to home using GPS. I was using a cell phone that didn't have a data plan associated with it, and it still comes back to home using its own GPS. However, if you use a cell phone with a data plan, your GPS menu becomes all the more functional, showing, you know, the exact map and the satellite view. In addition to flying this manually, there are so many autonomous features, flight planning, and waypoints I have not really experimented with. I mean, I could wait another couple weeks for this video to go out and experiment with them all, but honestly, I normally fly drones manually. I like the manual control. I'm not so interested in the waypoints and the autonomous functionality, although the active track was a fun thing to experiment with. The gimbal cover is a bit large and a little bit cumbersome to take off and put back on. Takes a few tries to really, you know, practice and get good doing it. Now, even though this drone has everything that you'd want in a prosumer drone, there's one limiting factor, and it's the gimbal tilt. You can adjust the gimbal tilt speed and sensitivity when you use the little dial on the back of the remote to tilt up and down that gimbal. but it doesn't seem to change the fact that there's no smooth ramping from 0 movement to the next speed of tilt. So it kind of snaps into movement, and it doesn't have that gradual start and stop that I'd like to see in a professional drone. If they could fix that one small issue, this drone would replace all of my other camera drones for professional video purposes. Now, there are definitely a lot of other accessories for the Autel EVO II. I have a bag. I just bought this, and this makes it a lot more easy to tote around instead of putting it back into the box. The box is nice, but you really want to have something dedicated. Some of those combo kits that include a hard case and an extra battery or whatever will put this well over $2,000 US. But as it stands right now, you can buy it on B&H Photo for about $1,800 with the drone, 1 battery, remote, and some of these extra cables and the charger. So, you know, it's not the cheapest drone in the world, but you got to think it's a 6K camera, 1-inch sensor, you know, fully autonomous flight with the obstacle avoidance surrounding this thing, 40-minute flight time, compact design that you can fold up and put into a very small bag, and professional capabilities like, you know, your 10-bit log and your HDR and your high dynamic range and all that stuff, the 6K video that makes this something you can use in a professional environment. There is a purchase link in the video description to this drone. So thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy flying.